I'm Gretchen Hirsch. I am a sewer, I'm a sewing blogger, I'm a pattern designer, and a sewing author. I've been sewing my own clothes for, I don't know, maybe 10 years now, and I definitely wear all the things that I make, and it's definitely part of my wardrobe. I love styles from the 40s and 50s. I think there's nothing better than that era, fashion-wise. It's so much more creative to make your own clothes. You get to think about, obviously, the fits and the fabric, and even design some elements for yourself. There's definitely something very soothing about sewing to me. Today we're going to make an easy gathered waist skirt with a waistband. This is a great project for a beginner. Even if you've never made a garment before, this is going to be the project to start with. It's easy, but it also teaches you a lot of skills that are going to help you down the road, like how to sew a waistband, how to do a lap zipper, and how to do a beautiful narrow hem. So let's talk about the supplies you're going to need. First of all, some pattern making supplies. This is very simple pattern making. You'll just need some wide, plain paper. What I've got here is just butcher's paper, which you can get a roll of. I ordered this online from Amazon, but you can also just go to your craft hobby art store and get it. You can also buy specialty pattern making paper from fashion supply or sewing supply stores. Whatever, just as long as it's a wide piece of paper, you're going to be fine. You're also going to need some measuring supplies for your pattern making. Something like a yardstick or an L square like this. Lots of people have yardsticks laying around the house, so that might be something to use. You don't need an L square, but that's what I have today because it does help me get a nice 90-degree angle on my pattern, but it's definitely not necessary. A yardstick is fine. You're also going to want a clear gridded ruler. This is one of my favorite sewing supplies ever. I have about 10 of them wandering around the sewing room at any given time. I use this so much. It's 2 by 18 inches. It's clear and it has a grid for every 1/8 of an inch mark. So it's great for adding seam allowances, which is something we're going to need to do today. You'll also want a measuring tape because we're going to take your measurements and make the pattern from your measurements. You'll also want a pencil to make your pattern with. I'm going to be using a Sharpie just so you can see it, but I don't generally recommend making patterns with Sharpies, but that's what I'm going to use. Okay, you'll also want a few different kinds of scissors. For your pattern making, for your paper, you're going to want paper scissors. You never want to mix paper and fabric scissors. You want to have one special scissor for each type of cutting. So have just some regular cheap paper scissors to cut your pattern with. And then you'll want some nice sharp fabric shears like this to cut your fabric with. The other thing we're going to talk about is finishing your seam allowances. And today we're just going to use a really simple finish using pinking shears. If you have a finish that you prefer, that's fine, but I'm going to use pinking shears on camera because it's just super easy and fast. You'll also want some marking supplies for your fabric. I just have some chalk pens here, a pencil, which is great, and then also I love these little chalk pens. They have a little rotary kind of thing that dispenses chalk in a thin line. These are excellent, so I highly recommend these. To actually make your skirt for the fabric, you're going to need about 2 yards of fabric, and that's kind of an approximate measurement for an adult-sized woman. So generally, if you're making it for an adult, 2 yards will be fine. If you're making it for a toddler, probably 1 yard will be fine. If you're making it for a larger waist measurement, you might need more. So that's just a general guideline. 2 yards should be fine. Type of fabric, I've made this skirt in a really stiff taffeta, and it really stands out and is very dramatic and has that like super full 50s look to it. Not everyone likes that, so what I'm going to do today is make it in this really nice drapey rayon challis, which is going to give a softer, flowier effect, and it's going to look like a totally different design even though it's the exact same pattern. So depending on your personal style, you might want to choose something that's really stiff and gives you like a full party kind of effect, or something that's just a little more low-key and drapey like this. I would avoid anything that's too slippery, like I wouldn't do like a silk charmeuse or a chiffon or anything that's too difficult to work with, just because we are going to be doing a lap zipper or a narrow hem, and nothing sheer because we're not doing a lining today, though that's something you might want to learn how to do in the future. So you'll also want some fusible interfacing. Interfacing is a utility fabric, so it could be fusible or sew-in. We're going to use fusible. Interfacing is essentially a stiffener for fabrics. Anywhere that you need a little extra body on a garment, collars and cuffs are a great example, you're going to use an interfacing. In the case of a skirt, a waistband really needs a little bit of extra body so it doesn't wrinkle and kind of slouch throughout the day. So we're going to be using a woven fusible interfacing to give the waistband just a little bit of extra body and make sure it stays nice and crisp. You will also want a zipper. okay? Look for a regular zipper, not an invisible zipper. It should be 7 to 9 inches. Either of those measurements will be fine. You're gonna need thread to match your fabric. You'll want an all-purpose polyester thread. That's your general everyday sewing thread, just for regular weight fabrics. So look for polyester, standard or general use thread, also called all-purpose sometimes. You'll want a hook and eye closure. This is a hook and bar technically. And then just a few miscellaneous supplies. Dental floss, you don't generally have this in the sewing room very often, but we do use it today, so go into the bathroom and grab some dental floss. We're gonna use this for a gathering technique that I really like, so I cannot wait to show you this. We also are gonna need a hand sewing needle to do just a little bit of finishing on the skirt, so make sure you have one of those. And then just a pin cushion with regular sewing pins. And that's pretty much it. That's all the supplies you're gonna need to make this fun gathered waist skirt. Now that we've gone over all the supplies that you'll need, let's go to the first step, which is making the pattern. Okay, so I'm getting out my pattern making paper. I was just thinking about the first skirt that I ever made, which was when I was probably about 10 years old. And it was a very similar style to this skirt, which is a sort of classic, timeless, gathered waist skirt. But I remember the big thing then was to make skirts with elastic waistbands. And that's usually a beginner's project, is to make a gathered waist skirt with an elastic waistband. I personally don't really like that look, and I don't think that many people do, and you're not gonna be very happy with your skirt if you have an elastic waistband, which is why we're gonna do a plain, sort of flat, flattering waistband on this. So if I could go back to my 10-year-old self, I would tell her not to do the elastic waistband. It's just not a good look for anyone. So I'm unrolling my pattern paper. I'm going to grab my supplies, like my your yardstick or your L-square, whichever one you have. You'll want to have your clear gridded ruler handy, your paper scissors, and then your pencil. But remember, I'm going to use my Sharpie just so you guys can see it. And you're going to need a few measurements, all right? The only measurement you really need for this is your waist measurement. This skirt is worn at your natural waist. You could choose to wear it a little bit lower, but it kind of sits very nicely and more flattering right at the smallest part of the waist. So that's the measurement you need. So you're going to take your tape measure. Okay, so if you're making this for yourself, it's very easy to get this measurement yourself, or you can take it on someone else. The important thing is that you want to measure the smallest part of your waist. So the way you can do that is the little teapot move, where you go like this and you kind of feel where your waist bends. That's where the skirt is going to sit. So take your tape measure, and this isn't like a loose, slouchy garment, so you want it to be like a little bit snug here. And then take your measurement like that. And that's the measurement that you're gonna need for the skirt pattern, okay? So mine is 29. Yours might be totally different. If you're doing it for a toddler, it's gonna be a lot smaller. Whatever it is, that's your measurement, okay? So you're gonna take that measurement. We're gonna make a big rectangle, okay? All this skirt is a rectangle that gets gathered into a smaller rectangle, which is the waistband. So we're gonna make two rectangular pattern pieces. We're gonna start with a big rectangle. The width of the rectangle across is going to be your waist measurement divided by 2. Okay, mine was 29, divided by 2 is 14.5. Now we're going to multiply it by 3, okay? Because we want it to be 3 times as wide as each side of the waist, the front and the back, and then gather it in. So my measurement, 14.5 times 3 is 43.5. So that's gonna be my measurement across. My measurement down is going to be the desired length of the skirt. Again, this skirt is totally customizable, so you could make it a mini skirt, you could make it 18 inches and make it kind of a little risque and daring. I make mine about 22.5 inches. It just kind of, I'm 5'6", just for reference, and it skims the top of my knee. You could also make this a full-length skirt if you want something for evening. If you're making it for a baby or a little girl, obviously it's gonna be a lot shorter. So whatever the measurement, your desired measurement is, your length, that is going to be the length of the pattern piece. Okay, so just to recap, I'm making a rectangle that is 43.5 by 22.5. So let's start by getting a nice 90-degree angle at the bottom of our paper. And you know what? I'm just going to use the bottom. No, I'm not. That's a bad idea. I'm going to start close to the bottom of my paper. I was just thinking that I'm going to need to add a seam allowance later. So you don't want to make this as close as possible to the edge. You're going to want to leave a little room at the bottom. Okay, so to kind of think about how much room you're going to need on your pattern paper, you can always use your tape measure and just kind of plot it out. You know, mine's going to need to be 43.5. It's pretty wide, you know, because we have all those gathers at the waist, which is what makes this skirt so fun. So you're going to need a lot of paper here. So 43.5 by 22.5. All right, so I'm going to start over here in this corner. I'm going to make myself a nice 90-degree angle over here. You can do this with your yardstick or your clear gridded ruler, totally up to you. Okay, so now I've got a nice corner. I need to continue it up 22.5. So let me mark that here. 22.5 is going to be here. So I can make another 90-degree angle up here. If you do have an L square, you can see this is a pretty handy tool to have because you can make perfect right angles with it. But it's not a big deal if you don't. You can always use your clear gridded ruler for this or your yardstick. Okay, so that's the beginning of my rectangle. So I'm just going to continue making my rectangle here. Because I'm making such a long side of this rectangle, one thing you can do to help yourself out is just kind of plot out the length before you make that line. I know it's going to be 43.5, so I'm going to use my tape measure and kind of make a little dot over here just so I know where I'm going. And now I can continue this line here. All right, and again, make sure you're nice and straight. You're continuing the line that you've already made, so make sure that you're aligned with it before you start drawing. And there we go, I'm at my mark. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another 90-degree angle over here, going up. Actually, why don't I do it this way? Because then I will be able to measure 22.5 inches because I'm going the long way. All right, so we're just going up to 22.5 here, just like we did on the other short end. 22.5, yep, okay. So now I just need to kind of fill in this space here by drawing my fourth right angle so that I can complete the rectangle. Perfect, and now I'll just want to connect these lines here, so I don't have an empty spot in the middle of my pattern. And there we have it, a nice rectangle that is 43.5 by 22.5 long. Now, the last thing we need to do is add seam allowances, right? Because this does not include that bit of fabric that you need to actually sew into the seams of the fabric. Very important. Okay, we're gonna add 5/8 of an inch all the way around the rectangle. 5/8 of an inch is the standard home sewing seam allowance. I don't really know why, except that it just is sort of like a nice medium kind of number. It's not too small. It's not so big that it becomes unwieldy, but 5/8 of an inch is what we always use, so that's what we're going to use here. So this is where the clear gridded ruler comes in handy. You're going to want to align 5/8 of an inch with your black mark or your pencil mark that you've made on the rectangle here. And all the way around, you're adding 5/8 of an inch. So it's just another outline of the rectangle that's 5/8 of an inch bigger, okay? So you want to do this all the way around. And adding seam allowances is something that you'll want to get good at, especially if you want to start making more of your own patterns. I know that when I started making my own patterns, it felt really empowering, like I could make whatever I wanted. And these are the kind of things you have to think about, is adding seam allowance, making sure you have the right dimensions. So it's great to get started with this on one of your first projects. All right, so don't forget the short ends. Okay, so I'm finishing up drawing my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I was just thinking about how my beginner sewing students never know where to find 5/8 of an inch on a ruler because it's such a strange sort of obscure measurement that you never use in real life except for sewing. So I always tell them, just go one little block past the 1/2 inch, and that's how you find your 5/8 of an inch. So you're going to also want to label your pattern piece. I always think I'm going to remember what my pattern pieces are. I never ever do. I think, oh, what's this big piece piece of pattern making paper and I throw it away. It might be something that I wanted. So mark on your pattern piece, you know, gathered waist skirt. You always sort of label your pattern pieces so you remember what they are. I like to put the measurement I made them for, so 29-inch waist, and then skirt front and back. I also sometimes give myself cutting instructions, so I might say cut 2. Because remember, you're going to need to cut 1 for the front and 1 for the back. Okay, that is our skirt front and back. Next thing we're going to do is make the pattern for the waistband. So you can kind of just roughly cut out around this for now. And I'm just going to cut all the way up my paper. Oh, there we go. Okay, and I'm going to use this blank space up here to make my waistband. The waistband is a long, skinny rectangle, so we don't need quite as much length. So I'm going to just put this pattern piece aside for now, and I'm going to make my waistband. All right, the length of the waistband is very easy. It's your waist measurement, which we already took, mine is 29, plus 1/2 inch, okay? I like to do 1/2 inch to just have a little bit of extra ease around the waist. No one likes to feel like they're so constricted that they can't eat or breathe or anything like that. So let's just add 1/2 inch for a little bit of extra ease for moving, eating, breathing, all that good stuff. And then the width of this rectangle is going to be double the width of the finished waistband. On my red skirt, I made the waistband 1.5 inches, which is a nice sort of medium-sized waistband, not too wide, not too skinny. So to double that, I would get 3, right? 1.5 by 2 is 3. So that's going to be my width of my waistband. So let's start by making a long, skinny rectangle that is 3 by 29.5. There's my Sharpie. Okay, so again, we're gonna need some right angles. I'm gonna start down here like this. Again, leave room for seam allowances. We're gonna have seam allowances all around this piece. So let's make this 3 inches tall. And I'm going to make my right angle here. I'm going to need to extend it further because my ruler only goes to 24. So I'll make a mark here. And now I know I need to extend it another 5.5 inches to get to 29.5. Go. I think a lot of people are intimidated by pattern making, but it's really just drawing shapes on paper, and especially with an easy skirt like this, it's just a couple rectangles. So this is a great intro to pattern making too. All right, 29.5 is going to be right here. There we go. I'm going to make another right angle on the other side that goes up 3 inches. And then just connect it with a long, skinny line on this side. There we go, and I'm going to continue it on this side, making sure I have a nice right angle in this upper corner. And that it's 3 inches tall. And there we have it, long, skinny rectangle. Okay, one thing about the waistband is that you need an overlap on the zipper side, okay? You don't want it to butt up right against each other on this side. You want to actually have an extra inch on the front side of the zipper so that you can put a hook and eye underneath it. So it's an overlap with a hook and eye underneath it. So you need an extra inch on one side of your waistband. So let's add it on this side. Actually, let's add it on this side since we have more paper over here. I'm going to use my clear gridded ruler. I'm going to mark out 1 inch here. I'm going to connect my lines. So there we go. So my waist measurement plus 1/2 inch, and then another inch for my overlap. Now the last thing to do is, just like on the skirt pattern piece, is add 5/8 of an inch all the way around for our seam allowances. So on all 4 sides, I'm going to add 5/8 of an inch. So at this point, you're probably feeling pretty comfortable adding seam allowances, which is great because that's something that you're going to be doing a lot of once you start making more patterns and altering patterns and just getting a little more creative with your sewing. So even on my overlap, I need to add that 5/8 of an inch. Anytime you sew one piece of fabric to another, you need a seam allowance because there's a little bit of fabric that disappears when you sew the two pieces together. Okay, just connect these here. And there we go. That is our waistband piece. That's all there is to it. So again, you're going to want to label your pieces. I'm going to call it the same thing that I called the other pattern piece so that I know that they go together. So gathered waist skirt, 29-inch waist. And what am I going to write next? I'm going to write waistband so that I know what the pattern piece is. Waistband. And for this one, I will write cut 1 fabric, cut 1 interfacing. Remember, we talked about interfacing earlier, how it's a stiffener for the waistband. So we are also going to use this pattern piece to cut out our fusible interfacing. Okay, so now we can just kind of roughly cut around this piece. And so now we've made a very simple but very cute pattern for a very easy skirt to make. The next thing I'm going to do is just cut out more precisely around my pattern pieces. So make sure that you use your paper scissors for this. You don't want to use your fabric shears. Make sure to keep them separate. You know, it's not a huge deal. Some people, you know, kind of act like it's the end of the world if you use your paper scissors on your fabric or vice versa. But paper does dull scissors quicker than fabric does. So, but in any case, you need to get your scissors sharpened regularly, your fabric scissors. So, you know, they're going to get dull over time in any case. So, but I try to keep them separate as much as possible. You know, one thing that people ask me when cutting patterns is, what side of the line do you cut on? Am I cutting away my line? Am I leaving my line intact? It's one of those like beginner questions that people get really uptight about, and they're really scared to cut away their pattern. And the official rule on this is that you want to leave your pattern line there, okay? So you're cutting to the outside of your line. I have a nice thick Sharpie line. You shouldn't have that. You'll have a pencil line. You want to leave your line intact, right? Because that's part of your pattern. So cut to the outside of that line as much as possible. So precision is important here. This always feels like arts and crafts hour to me. Just cutting out our butcher's paper. All right, there we go. So now we have our pattern piece nice and cut out. And you're going to want to do the same thing on the other one. And now I have a big piece to cut out. And again, I'm just going to cut to the outside of my lines. I have a friend who gets very, very nervous about cutting out paper for some reason. She's a lefty and she feels like she's really not good at it. So I know that this produces anxiety for some people. It's really not a big deal. Just try to be as precise as possible. Just get to the edge of that line. And take your time if you need to. It's not a rush. I always say, you know, give yourself plenty of time when making a garment like this. You don't want to feel rushed. You want it to be enjoyable. So these patterns are totally reusable. With something like this, you know, you can make it in a lot of different fabrics and have a whole wardrobe of skirts. But the great thing about this butcher's paper is that it's kind of tough, you know. We're going to pin through it and cut around it and all that, but it can last for many, many uses. So you can use this as many times as you want now that you have the pattern. A lot of people ask about how to, you know, organize and store their patterns, and I like to keep mine in separate manila envelopes, just so that they stay together. I'll just fold them up and put them in an envelope, and then, you know, put the name of the pattern on the outside of the envelope, and then kind of keep them filed all together. I mean, filing is kind of like a formal word for it. I'm not really that organized, but that's a nice way to keep things together. In fashion school, they have you put like big holes through each pattern piece and then put them on a hook, on a hanger, so you have all your patterns hanging and ready to go. That's another option. The most important thing is to keep each garment, keep those pattern pieces together. I am horrible about this, about letting pieces kind of get lost, and then I have a box that's called, what's it called, like abandoned pattern pieces or something like that, and I have no idea what they go to, and they just kind of live in there for the end of time until I finally throw them away. So most important thing is to just like keep those pieces together, and then whether you want to put them in a folder or pin them together and hang them, totally up to you, but just keep them together. Okay, so now I have both pieces cut out. We're ready to move on to cutting out your fabric. All right, we don't need our rulers or anything anymore. These are just for pattern making, really. So let's move these over to the side. Paper scissors we're not really going to be using. I'm going to move these pattern pieces over, and I'm going to get out the fabric. You're going to need your interfacing, so kind of keep that to the side there. This is always kind of the fun part because you get to start working with the fabric. All right, so you're going to get out your yardage. Now for this skirt, I'm kind of thinking about how I'm going to lay this out. And yes, it's wide enough to go this way. So we need to cut two of this front and back pattern piece, right? So the easiest way to do that is to double up your fabric and cut them both at once, okay? That's called cutting on a double layer. Now, normally when you're cutting fabric, you're gonna fold selvage to selvage. This finished edge of the fabric, not the cut edge, but the finished edge, is called the selvage. It's kind of tightly woven, and sometimes it'll have this fringe on it, okay? So what we're doing is, normally you would fold selvage on top of selvage, or selvage to selvage, which means we would fold the whole piece lengthwise like that, put the pieces on top of each other. Because we're working with a wide pattern piece, the way I'm going to do this is to fold it this way. So not lengthwise, but widthwise. I always get those two mixed up. So what we're going to do, we're going to fold the cut edge down here. And I want you to note how I'm folding the right sides of the fabric together, okay? That's standard for cutting. You always want to have, you're kind of creating a little fabric and pattern sandwich here, and you always want to have the right side of the fabric on the inside of your fold. Okay, so lay it out nice and smoothly. Make sure that you have enough of a fold here to cut the whole thing, and I do. All right, I'm gonna get some of this out of the way. Let me get this paper out of the way too. Just move this back here. Okay, that's better. All right, so when you're laying out fabric, one of the most important things is that you get everything nice and aligned. So on these edges, I want the selvages right on top of each other. Same thing on this end too. Okay, so just really smooth everything out there. So smooth everything out from the center. And then I like to make sure that this is nice and straight. The fold of the fabric up here, I want to make sure that it looks nice and straight. It's nice having one of these gridded mats on the table so you can align your fabric with one of the grids, one of the lines. That helps you kind of get everything nice and straight there. There we go. All right, so now I have, my selvages are here, my fabric is folded this way, like a little sandwich or a burrito taco. And now we are going to put down the big rectangle to cut out. Like this. Okay, so I'm going to use my wrist pin cushion to keep my pins nice and handy. Okay, so I'm just making sure that my fabric is folded, that it looks straight down here, and we look good. All right. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm just making sure that I have enough of a fold here Let me just fix this really quickly. I'm going to fold it down a little bit more so that I have more fabric to work with, so I'm not cutting too close to the edge of the fabric here. And as you can see, it's good to have a big surface to do this with. Not everyone has the luxury of having a nice custom cutting table like we have here, but you know, you can always do this on the floor. It's not very easy on the back, but it is an option. Or if you have a dining room table or something like that that you can clear off. There we go. I like that a lot better. Okay, so I just have a little more extra room around the edges to cut because you don't want to be cutting right on the edge of the fabric. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to align this straight edge of the pattern with the inside of the selvage. So there we go. There's that kind of tightly woven portion of the selvage that's white. It's lighter in color than the rest of the fabric. And I'm aligning the straight edge of the pattern with that. And as you go, you might just need to make sure that your selvages are right on top of each other and smooth it out again. Okay, we just laid out the fabric and now I'm going to put the pattern down on top of it and pin it down. And what you're going to want to do is align one of these short edges of the pattern with the selvage over here. It doesn't have to be right on top of the selvage, but I would align it with the inside of the selvage. And the reason you do that is a really long and boring thing, which is all about grain lines. Fabric has a grain, basically the direction the threads are woven in. And you want those grains to go straight down the center of the body. So by aligning the straight edge of the straight edge of the pattern with this straight edge of the fabric, I know that those threads that make up the weave of the fabric, they're going to be going straight up and down the body. What happens with grain lines when they get distorted is they make the fabric twist and lay in ways that don't look nice and don't wear well over time. So that's kind of the short answer for why you want to align that edge with the selvage, just to get the grain lines nice and straight. So you'll see I pinned down one side, now I'm pinning down this next side. You don't have to go crazy with pins, but I put one, maybe every 4 or 5 inches. Just so that you get the edges of the pattern nice and flat and it's not curling up. Because we're going to be cutting right next to the edge of the paper, and we want it to be nice and flat here. So it's very important that the corners are laying flat. That's a part that you're really going to want to pin well, because you're going to have to cut around there. So sometimes I'll even start by doing my corners and then come back and do these long edges. And I usually pin, this is another thing the beginners ask is, do I pin this way or that way? And the way that I always do it and was taught was that I place my pins so that they're parallel to the pattern edge. Some people do it so it's perpendicular. This is just my preference. It's always felt right to me and it's the way I learned. But if you wanted to do it another way, I don't see why you couldn't. So, but just something to think about. I mean, one thing I always tell people is that it's a good idea to be consistent no matter what you choose to do, especially on one garment. Put all your pins in one direction, keep it nice and neat and laying flat. Okay, I'm pinned all the way around. Oh, I want to get this corner here. All right, so my pattern is nice and flat on my fabric. Now I'm going to get out my fabric shears, all right, with nice sharp fabric shears, and I'm going to cut around the paper pattern. For some people, this can feel a little weird if this is the first time you've done it. What's important is that you get as close to the paper pattern without actually cutting it. And then you might find that you have a preference for the direction you cut in. So I'm cutting it this way because I always like, just a weird physical thing I have is that when I cut, I like my pattern to be to the right side of the blade of my scissors. Some people are totally the opposite and they would cut that way, but that feels really weird to me. So if you start cutting and it feels strange, just change directions and maybe that is the way to go for you. The important thing is that you take nice long cuts with the blade of your scissors. Now I can kind of move this away and kind of shift the pattern piece around. You want to avoid shifting too much, but it's better if you can actually be the thing to shift rather than having to shift your fabric and your pattern. Because remember, we spent some time trying to get the the fabric nice and smooth. So you don't want to shift it around too much, especially if it's something that's slippery and moves around a lot. So, if I had room to move all around this table and we weren't filming, that's what I would do. I would go around there and cut from that side. But because I want to keep it nice and flat and stay on this side of the table, I'm just going to go like this. But in general, I would advise you that you should move rather than moving the pattern piece. I'm just totally breaking that rule right now. Okay, now let's cut down this edge. This is a nice, easy pattern to cut out, obviously. No armhole curves or neckline curves or anything tricky. So there we go. So because we cut on a fold of fabric, we now have two of this, right? We have a front and a back of the skirt. We can put this aside because now we need to cut the waistband. Now, as you might remember, when we labeled our waistband pattern piece, we only need to cut one of these, okay? Because it's going to get folded over and going to be doubled in on itself. So we only need one. When you're cutting in a single layer, the rule is, just for consistency's sake again, is to cut with the right side of the fabric facing up. So I'm doing this floral print, I should see those flowers facing up. I don't want to see the lighter faded side. That's the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, let me grab my waistband piece. It's my long skinny piece. And again, I'm just going to place it down on the fabric. This is a little easier to deal with because it's not so huge. I'm going to align one of these straight edges, the short edges, with the edge of the selvage here. Oops, lost a pin. I'm going to pin all the way around again. And let's talk about pins for a minute. I see people when they start sewing use those pins with the really big bulbous balls on the ends that are plastic. And they're very difficult to work with. And I know a lot of people have problems pinning when they first start sewing. And in many cases, it's the pin, it's not you. I really like, these are called silk pins, and they have a glass head ball. Okay, so they're glass, so you can iron over them, unlike the plastic where if you iron them, they melt, which is very disturbing. So I would recommend these pins. They really make pinning so easy. And once you go to this kind of pin, you will never go back to those plastic head ones. Okay, so now that you've got it nice and flat, we're just going to cut again using our fabric shears. So just to avoid having any raggedy edges here, the most important thing you can do is to take longish cuts with your scissors. So avoid taking tiny little bites, I guess would be the word, where you kind of end up chewing the fabric. You want to think of it as being like nice and long and smooth cuts of the blade. One of my favorite sounds in the world is like a nice sharp pair of scissors cutting fabric. It's just a beautiful sound. So you want to hear that nice whoosh, 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 okay? You don't want to hear like gnawing on the fabric. Okay. All right, now we have our waistband cut out. The last thing we need to do in cutting is cut out our fusible interfacing. So grab your fusible interfacing. We just need one of these. I am going to, sometimes fusible interfacing comes in very, very narrow widths, and you can see it does here. This is the entire width of the interfacing. So I got a couple yards just to make sure that I would have enough because it's not as wide as the fabric. So I'm just going to align this long edge with, so that it's parallel to the selvage of the interfacing. The interfacing can go, it doesn't have, well, it does have a right or wrong side. I was going to say it doesn't have a right or wrong side like the fabric does, but it has one side with glue on it and one side without glue on it. The side with glue is bumpy. It has like a texture to it. That's the side that obviously gets fused to the fabric. It doesn't matter for our purposes right now which side you have facing up. This pattern piece is totally symmetrical, so we're going to be able to align the interfacing either up or down on the wrong side of the fabric and it'll be fine. So don't worry about which side of the interfacing is up. All right, we're going to cut around this piece. Okay, so I'm finished cutting out my interfacing with my skirt waistband piece. I have the skirt front and back cut out in my fabric. And now there's one last thing we need to cut out, and that is some strips of fusible interfacing to stabilize the zipper opening. This is something that a lot of beginning sewing books and classes do not tell you, but it's so important to have stabilization at your zipper opening. So we're gonna get a little more into how to do it later and why it's important, but for now, I just want you to know that you need to cut 2 1-inch strips of interfacing that are a little bit longer than your zipper length. So I have a 9-inch zipper. I'm gonna go ahead and just cut these strips 10 inches. So I have an extra inch on either end. And you can draw them onto your interfacing, you know, with your clear ruler, and a pencil is fine. Just draw some 10-inch strips here, or whatever. If you have a 7-inch zipper, you can make them 8 inches long. Let's see, let me turn this around, there we go. All right, so I'm gonna make 2 10-inch strips that are 1 inch wide. And in a minute, we're gonna iron these onto the zipper opening. And if you've ever tried to put in a zipper before and it ended up ripply or kind of wonky somehow, it might have been because the zipper opening was not stabilized, and it just helps so much and it makes your finished product look so much nicer if you use this stabilization technique. Okay, so I'm gonna cut these out into little strips along my pencil marks. And some places sell rolls of strips of fusible interfacing already cut. So I would recommend having those on hand just if you do a lot of zippers so that you have them ready to go and you don't have to cut every time. The next thing I'm going to do is iron on these strips of fusible interfacing to my zipper opening on the skirt front and back. Okay, so you want to have your iron handy, you want to have your little strips, and you're going to grab the skirt front and back, and we're going to remove the pins now from the pattern so that we can take the pattern away completely. And so what we're going to be doing next is called fusing the interfacing to the fabric, okay? So I remember how I talked about how it has those little dots of glue on the wrong side of the interfacing? We're now going to use the heat from the iron to actually melt that glue and fuse the interfacing to the fabric itself. So now they're going to be like one piece of fabric, but with more body and a little more stiffness, which is exactly what we want. So take out all your pins. And then we'll be able to put aside our pattern piece. Okay, so you have your skirt front and back here. Because these are rectangles and they're symmetrical, it doesn't really matter what side you do this on. You just need to know that wherever you put these, that is going to become your zipper opening. And zipper openings on skirts are always on the left side if they're a side zipper opening rather than a back zipper opening. So essentially these need to go in the upper corner on each of these rectangles on the wrong side, okay? So you're fusing this interfacing strip to the wrong side of the fabric, so this is the more faded side of the fabric. It's not quite as bright and vibrant as the right side. I'm feeling my interfacing strips so that I know which is the wrong side. And the way I can tell is that one is bumpier and has more texture than the other. The bumpy side is the glue dots that we talked about, okay? So we want that to go face down. Glue should go next to the fabric like this, and this should go in the upper corner in the seam allowance like that, okay? Now when I'm fusing interfacing, I always like to use a press cloth. I have gotten it wrong and put the interfacing glue side up before, in which case if you don't use a press cloth, it fuses to your iron, which is awful because it like never comes off. It takes forever to get that burnt residue off. So it's nice to use a press cloth. I'm just using a square of muslin here. You can, if you want it to be something you can see through, silk organza is really nice. That's kind of my favorite. But you're just going to put it on top of where you're fusing here. It also keeps the glue from seeping through the interfacing and adhering to the iron and burning. Okay, so to fuse interfacing, you just need your iron, you need your press cloth. You're going to hold it down where you're fusing and just hold it. It's going to feel a little weird because when you're ironing or pressing, you're used to kind of moving around a lot. With this kind of thing, we need to get enough heat building up there that it's actually going to melt the glue. So you want to hold it for at least 10 seconds is kind of the guideline I give myself. And you want your iron set to a high-ish temperature, but you don't want to make it too high for your fabric, okay? So rayon is not as hardy as something like cotton, so I don't have this on the highest setting possible. I have it on like a medium setting, okay? And I'm gonna go and after I finish fusing here, I'm gonna check that it's adhered. If it's not adhered, then I might wanna up the temperature a little bit, but it should be fine. So let's take this off and see if we're adhered. Okay, so what you're looking for is you want the edges of the interfacing to be completely glued down. You don't want it to move around at all. You don't want to see any bubbles or anything like that. You want it to be nice and stable there. So that's looking good. So we can move on to the next piece. All right, so these two seam allowances are going to be right next to each other, and this is where the zipper is going to be eventually. And you can kind of see the texture of this fabric now is a lot stiffer in the opening, and this is going to make your zipper so much easier to put in. I just can't really even overemphasize how much this is going to help you put your zipper in. Like I said, it's a step that a lot of beginner sewing classes and books skip. I think it's so important because it keeps the fabric from stretching out when you insert the zipper. And that's something that can be very frustrating if you insert one side of a zipper, go to sew the other side, and the first side is longer because it's stretched out and they don't match up anymore. That's really annoying. The other thing that can happen is that the fabric is too soft for top stitching, and then your zipper area can kind of start to ripple around the zipper stitching. So the fusible interfacing that we're putting here is going to help avoid all of those issues, and it's going to make your zipper look really nice and professional. Okay, so I just want to stress again that when you're fusing interfacing to fabric, you don't want to be moving the iron around a lot. You want to put it down for 10 seconds, pick it up, put it down for another 10 seconds, okay? Don't rub back and forth and don't, kind of move it up and down a lot. You just want to go to each area that you need to and keep the iron held there. All right, we're going to check that it's fused. Again, I kind of use my nail to kind of see if I can pull up the edges, and I can't, so that's what we're looking for. So now I can put these pieces aside. We're all fused on the skirt zipper opening. And the next thing we need to do is fuse the waistband, okay? So I'm going to grab my waistband piece, and I'm going to take off my pins here. And in this case, we're not just fusing a small area, we're fusing the entire piece of the garment, okay? So like we talked about, this is just to make the waistband have more body. What can happen with waistbands is they start to wrinkle throughout the day and look kind of messy. But fusible interfacing will help stabilize the area so that it doesn't wrinkle as easily. All right, so again, we're working with the fabric wrong side up, working with the interfacing glue side down on the fabric. You just want to match your edges as much as possible here. Use your press cloth. So like I said, I'm using muslin here. You can just use a scrap of fabric. This is going to take a little while because I have to go all the way down this waistband. But one thing I wanted to mention was that if you check for fusing to see if it's adhered and it hasn't adhered, what you need to go back and do is hold the iron there for longer. For some fabrics, you also need to use a little bit of steam. So on this case, I would use this button here and just apply a little bit of steam to help activate the glue. But mine seems to be adhering well. The other thing you can do is also raise the temperature of your iron. If you're comfortable with that with the fabric you're using, that you don't think it's going to be too hot, you know, some fabrics like silks, also polyester, can be very sensitive to high heats. So you want to make sure that you're not going too high for your particular fabric. Again, the press cloth is great because it helps avoid damaging your fabric if you're using a high heat. So a press cloth is something that you can use anytime, not just if you're fusing interfacing. If you want to protect your fabric from the iron, put a press cloth between the fabric and the iron. It's also good for wools, which can get shiny marks if you iron on the right side of it directly. So you can use a press cloth between, just as a barrier between the iron and the fabric. Okay, so as I'm going to hold the iron. I'm going to see, it can also kind of, those edges will kind of stick to your ironing board, which is a little annoying, but it's not a huge deal. Just go back and make sure that this completely adhered. It's very important that you make sure you have a good fuse between the interfacing and the fabric. If you don't, the two pieces can start to separate with wear, and especially they can start to separate when you wash them, okay? And then you might see bubbling and ripples on the fabric. So really take your time with this. Make sure that it's well adhered and that it's not coming up in any places. So I'm at the end of the waistband here. I'm going to put the iron aside and pull this up. Yeah, it did fuse a little bit to the ironing board. That's fine. Just pull it up. And then I'm just going to make sure, just lift it up and kind of check with your hands, like ripple it a little bit, and make sure that it doesn't detach in any areas. You can start to see little bubbles if it's not well fused, but it looks like it's good. And so you can really see the difference in the fabric. See how it has like a nice body to it and nice hand to it, as opposed to the skirt fabric, which is what we want here. We want the skirt to be nice and flowy, but it definitely has a very different hand now, which is exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so now we've fused everything that we need to fuse, and now we can finally move on and get started sewing. Okay, we're ready to sew our side seams. So go ahead and grab your skirt front and back, and we're gonna sew the side seam with the zipper opening first, okay? So I want you to locate the corners where you put the fusible interfacing strips for stabilization, and those two are gonna go on top of each other, okay? So I wanna make sure when you put the right sides of the skirt together, which is what we're doing, taking those two big rectangles, putting them on top of each other, right sides together, that those strips of fusible are on top of each other. So I've got one here and then one here. So the right sides are facing each other like that. We're going to sew from the zipper base down to the hem of the skirt, okay? So you need to figure out where to start sewing, where your zipper is going to end, essentially. So you want to grab your zipper, and I'm just going to lay it on top of my fabric like this. The metal stop at the top of the zipper should be positioned 5/8 of an inch below the raw edge of the fabric. So I'm just going to place that here. And it works out so that the pinked edge of the top of the zipper is just slightly above the raw edge of the fabric. I'm going to lay this against here, and then you have another metal stop at the base of the zipper. So you're going to start pinning the fabric pieces together just below that metal stop, because that's where we're going to start sewing. We're going to leave an opening at the top of the side seam here to put our zipper in the next steps. Okay, so I'm putting a pin there so that I know where to start sewing. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the way down this side seam. And if you're confused about where the side seams are, these are the short seams, right? The short sides of the rectangle, not the long sides. And they're also the sides where you have this stabilization tape. So go all the way down, you're pinning all the way to the bottom. I always pin with my pins perpendicular to the raw edge of the fabric. And I like to have the glass head of the pin to the right of the raw edge, because I'm going to put it into the machine like this. And you always need to take out your pins as you sew. You never want to sew over a pin. You can break the needle that way, and it can be kind of dangerous because it can go kind of flying towards your eyes, which you don't want. So we're going to put it in this way, and that's why I put the glass heads on this side, so I can pull them out as I go. It's very convenient. All right, so I'm going to start sewing at this first pin. Our seam allowances are 5/8 of an inch, which you know because you made your own pattern. You're going to start right here where the pin is. I'm going to take the pin out so I don't sew over it. Make sure that my raw edges are aligned with the fabric, and I'm going to start sewing. So I have my machine on a regular straight stitch, which is up here, and then my length is down here. I want to be at 2.5. I want to make sure that my needle is centered in the middle of my presser foot over here, and so I'm ready to start sewing. You're going to go forward a couple stitches, and now you're going to reverse a couple stitches to secure your seam. This is called back stitching, you may know. All right, and now I can go forward all the way to the bottom of the seam. Be very careful to take out your pins, and also be very careful that the raw edges of your fabric stay right on top of each other. As I'm feeding my fabric, I like to use this hand to kind of hold the fabric taut, and then I can use my left hand to help feed the fabric through. And be very careful about your seam allowance here. You want to make sure that you're right on your 5/8 of an inch mark. Using a seam allowance that's too big or too small for your pattern can make the skirt fit differently than you expected, because it ends up being bigger or smaller than intended. Okay, so go all the way down to the end and then back stitch a few stitches. Okay, that was our first seam. So that's our zipper side. Obviously we sewed just from the zipper opening down to the hem. Now I'm going to trim my threads. A good habit to get into when you're sewing is to always trim the threads at the end of a seam, and then go back and trim the ones at the start of the seam so that you don't have a lot of loose threads hanging around. Okay, now I'm going to sew my other side seam. So I don't have the zipper opening to worry about here, so I can just sew from top to bottom. So if I'm pinning a piece like this, I usually like to start by pinning either end, the top and bottom, making sure that those edges align, and then kind of pulling the two pieces so that the fabric is distributed evenly and is nice and smooth, and then I pin between them. So again, I'm pinning with my pins perpendicular to the raw edge of the fabric, with the glass heads of the pins just kind of hanging off the edge there a little bit so I can pull them out easily as I go. Another reason I like using a wrist pin cushion rather than one that's freestanding is I can just take out the pins and put the pins back in my pin cushion as I sew. I don't really have to stop and do that. Okay, I'm all nice and pinned now. I'm going to start sewing at the top and sew all the way to the bottom. Some people like to backstitch by starting just a couple stitches in and then starting by backstitching and then going forward. You can do it that way. That's perfectly acceptable. Then you're not going back and forth, 3 times over that area. It's totally up to you. Okay, so remember you're holding your fabric nice and taut so that the layers don't shift as you sew. And you're making sure that your raw edges stay right on top of each other and they're nicely aligned. Take out your pins as you go. And when you get down to the very end of the fabric, you are going to backstitch again. Okay, so time to backstitch. And now trim your threads at the very end and at the very top. This is a really good habit to get into. I should practice it more than I preach it, because I often have garments when I'm done sewing them that have threads kind of hanging all off in them. I never really catch them, and I find them when I'm wearing them, and it's a good habit to just get into cutting them while you're sewing. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is finish my seam allowances with the pinking shears. So grab your pinking shears, and the way to do this is to do it before you actually press these seams open, so that you can just finish them together by trimming the very edge of the fabric with the pinking shears. Pinking shears will stop the fabric from raveling, which is what we want. If you've done any sewing before, you probably know that there are tons of ways to finish your seam allowances. If you read any sewing book, you'll find many different methods, and that's because there are different methods that you can use for different projects and for different fabrics. I'm going to keep trimming my seam allowances here with my pinking shears. You may have another method that you like to use, like zigzagging your seam allowances or serging. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. I always go back to pinking for really simple projects just because it's really basic and effective, and it also has kind of a cool vintage look that I've always really liked. So that's why we're using this one here, and this is going to keep these edges from fraying. You're going to want to do something to keep your seam allowances from fraying. So treat your fabric in some way, whether it's pinking, zigzagging, whatever you prefer. All right, so I'm going to do the other side, and for now I'm just going to pink up to the zipper opening. I don't want to pink past there because I don't want to remove any of those seam allowances yet, because I'm going to need them in my next step, which is putting in the zipper. All right, so just go all the way up till you get to the base of the zipper. So kind of where your stitching starts here. And then you can end your pinking there. Get any little loose bits there. All right, so now we've sewn our seams, we've pinked them, and next thing we need to do is press them. You want to press as you go. That's a very important principle in sewing, so I don't want to move on to the next step before I've pressed these seams. So I'm just going to scoot over to my iron here, and you want to press your seams flat first, okay? We're going to press them open in the next step, but first I want you to press them flat like this. This helps set the stitches, smooth everything out. And I'm going to do the other one, same way, pressing it flat, like this. Okay. All right, and so now we need to press the seams open. And because I have a flat ironing surface here, I'm just going to grab this little sleeve board, which helps you press anything that's in the round, right? Like this seam here. So I can put this over the sleeve board. Whoops, those are my little clippers. Okay, I'm going to put this over the sleeve board like this so that I can press this seam open. Just like this. Okay, so see how my seam allowances are kind of standing up right now? We're going to separate those seam allowances and press them open. Most important thing here is that you really have those seam allowances pressed open so that you're getting right into the, I guess you could call it like the ditch of the seam allowance. Otherwise you might get a weird little wrinkle there. All right. A lot of people, when they start sewing, they really hate this part of the process because no one likes ironing. But when you see how much nicer your seams look, see how they're laying flat now, and from the outside they're really beautiful and flat, then you're going to start to love pressing because it's just so satisfying. Okay, let's go to the other seam that we did, and this is the side seam with the zipper. We are going to press it open just to the base of the zipper opening. Press it open just like we did the other one. And there we go. All right, so now I'm going to put this aside, and we're ready to move on to putting in the zipper, which is super exciting. Okay, so we're doing a lapped zipper. This is a really cool zipper technique that kind of has a vintagey vibe to it. Every vintage dress or skirt I've ever picked up has a lapped zipper, as opposed to a centered zipper is another thing you can do, or an invisible zipper. Lapped has always been my favorite. I just love the way it looks, so that's what we're going to learn today. So as you're looking at your seam allowances here, at your zipper opening, it's kind of forming a V here. On the right side, this is going to be the zipper underlap. Okay, we're going to press this seam allowance in 1/2 inch. Okay, so grab that seam allowance, turn it to the right side, to the wrong side, sorry, and I'm going to turn this seam allowance in like this. You want to grab some sort of ruler, a seam gauge could work well here, and you're going to measure 1/2 inch out as you press. I'm pressing this to the wrong side. So, as you might have noticed, this is a little bit less than our seam allowance. Our seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. and we're only pressing in 1/2 inch. So we've got a little 1/8 of an inch extra that's going to form an underlap, and that's why it's called a lap zipper. All right, so as we get to the base here, where the seam allowance starts, I'm sorry, not the seam allowance, but the opening for the zipper, I'm going to continue pressing, and it's going to form what almost like a little pleat at the base of the zipper, because we haven't pressed it in the full 5/8 of an inch. So as you can see, I've got like this tiny little underlap there that's 1/8 of an inch on this, the base of the zipper here. Okay, on the other side, this is going to be the overlap. I'm going to press in the full seam allowance, so 5/8 of an inch. So again, just grab a ruler, a seam gauge, or something to help you out here so that you know you're pressing the correct amount. This is really important to do this the exact measurement that you need. One thing that helps as you're pressing a measurement like this is you can kind of, especially because it's kind of stiff here with a stabilized zipper opening, is you can measure it and then kind of finger press it to get a little crease, and then bring in the iron like that. Okay, so now we've prepared our zipper opening by pressing the seam allowances. Again, this side, the right side, as you're looking at the opening, we pressed under 1/2 inch. The left side is 5/8 of an inch. So let's go on over here and grab the zipper itself. And now would be a good time, I'm looking at my pinking scraps here and thinking that now would be a good time to pink. Now that I've actually pressed these and I have the correct seam allowance, I could pink these. So let's do that here, right in the zipper opening. Let's pink these seam allowances. This can be an easy step to forget because you get so involved in putting in the zipper at this point that you forget to finish the seam allowances. And it's not a huge deal because the zipper is going to be sewn here and they kind of get hidden anyway. But it always kind of bothers me if I don't finish them, so let's do it now. All right, so there's that side. Now, I want you to be very careful on this side not to take away too much of this seam allowance. Just pink right on the very, very edge of the fabric because we're going to need to top stitch this side and we're going to need that full seam allowance. So again, just be very delicate on the edge of the fabric here. Pinking like that. All right, so now you've got all these lovely little scraps. You're going to grab your zipper. We're going to work from the right side of the skirt. Take your zipper and you're going to pin on the right side first. Place the zipper underneath the seam allowance. The base of the zipper should be right here, right at the opening, so that metal stop should be right above your stitching. And remember, you have that little underlap pleat that forms here. And you're going to pin this in place. What's important is that the fold of the fabric, where you folded under the seam allowance and pressed it, that should align right next to the teeth of the zipper. The teeth are those raised bumpy bits here. So you want that edge of the fold to be right next to the teeth. Okay, and I'm pinning through both layers of the fold and then through the zipper tape, which is the sort of fabric-y part of the zipper. Okay, now that we have this side pinned, well, almost pinned, you're going to need to change the presser foot on your sewing machine. Your sewing machine will have come with a zipper foot, all right? It has a sort of narrow, I always think of it as the toe because this is a foot, so this would be the toe, a narrow toe at the front of the foot here. So you're going to remove your standard presser foot by just pressing in the lever on the back of the foot, and it should fall right off. You can pull that to the side. And now you're going to place your zipper foot on the shank here by lowering it. Lower the lever for the presser foot and it'll clip on. You want to make sure, usually these kinds of zipper feet have a little bar here so that you can place the shaft on either side, which helps you get close to one side of the zipper or the other. For now, you're gonna want the bulk of the presser foot to be to the right of the needle. And you'll see what I mean right now as I start sewing. All right, take your zipper pull and open the zipper so that it's out of your way. It's very hard to sew around that pull, so we're just gonna get it out of the way for now, temporarily. There we go. It might run into your pins. All right, and now I'm going to stitch right next to the zipper teeth, as close as I can. And that's what a zipper foot does. It just helps you stitch close to the teeth of the zipper. It's hard to stitch next to those teeth when you're using a regular presser foot because it's so wide. But the zipper foot is more narrow, so it helps you get into that kind of tight little area. Okay, now back stitch. And what I'm doing is I'm just stitching close to that fold of the fabric. And you can see how the toe of the presser foot is helping me get right next to those teeth. People get pretty freaked out by zippers, and I would say, you know, my advice would be to just take your time. You can stop at any time. I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think they just have to sew right through a seam without stopping and that you get some sort of prize for that or something. But I always stop a lot when I'm sewing because I like to rearrange things, take my pins out, whatever it is. So once I get down to that base of the seam there, I'm going to back stitch here. And then I can pull this out. I'm gonna grab my clippers from the floor. There we go. All right, I'm gonna trim these nice and close here. And at the top, there we go. Okay, now we can sew the other side of the zipper, and this is the overlap. So with the zipper closed, and if you've never sewn one of these zippers before, just take a minute to really pay attention to this and really study this, because a lot of people get confused on this step. What we need to do is close this overlap. This edge of the fabric is going to just cover the stitching line that we just did on the underlap. Okay, so starting from the bottom of the zipper, you're going to pin on this side of the fabric to the left of the zipper teeth, like this. Okay, so if I open this out like that, I can see the zipper underneath. This is going to form the overlap. And what I'm pinning through over here is these two layers of fabric and the zipper tape. All right, it's very important. A lot of people will accidentally pin on this side of the teeth, in which case I won't be able to open this, and that's a sign that you're doing it wrong. Okay, so you want to make sure that after you pin it, which is to the left of the zipper teeth, I can feel the teeth through here, and this should be to the left, that I can open that and I see the entirety of the zipper teeth here. All right, so keep pinning up that way. So you can kind of see why this is called a lap zipper at this point. It's because there's an overlap here that's covering the zipper. All right, now we're to the top of the zipper and there's a pull here. And that pull is always a little bit pesky, so just pin around it as best you can. Okay, I'm going to smooth this out a little bit. I feel like it might be a little bit wrinkly or something here, and you want to make sure that you don't have any excess fabric. It needs to be nice and smooth. So I'm just kind of making sure here. All right. There we go. So now we have, oops, I pinned through. See, this is one little mishap that can happen. I pinned through this layer of the skirt. We don't want that. You want to make sure, you can kind of test this to make sure that you did it right. That now that you've pinned it, test that you can open the zipper all the way up, okay? You should be able to open it like that. If you can't, if it's pinned shut or something like that, that means that you didn't pin to the left of the zipper teeth, or you might have pinned through too many layers like I just did. So make sure that you can open and close your zipper easily. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is top stitch this side of the zipper opening. It's gonna get stitched in an L shape over the zipper tape and then over the base of the zipper. So you need to move your zipper foot so that it's to the other side of the needle. So release that zipper foot like that, and then scoot it over so it's on the right side. All right, and now the toe is to the left of the needle. All right, open up your zipper, and you're going to start stitching about right here. You want your stitching to be about 3/8 of an inch. So you can use your 3/8 of an inch mark right here to use use the seam allowance mark for 3/8 of an inch as you start stitching. Now go nice and slow with this. This is top stitching. That means that it shows on the outside of your garment. So you want it to be nice and even. Take out your pins as you go. Keep everything nice and smooth and flat. And I'm using a contrasting color here so you guys can see it. Obviously this makes it even more distinct and noticeable. You're probably using a thread that blends in with your fabric, so you're not going to be able to see the top stitching as much, but it'll still be there. So this will be a good test of my skills on my top stitching, since I have this bright white thread here. All right. So it gets a little tricky as you get to the base of the zipper because, again, you've got that pesky pull to deal with. So get as close as you can. And take out your pins as you go. Okay, now I'm so close to the pull that I don't want to go any further because if you stitch over it, your needle will break. So now I'm going to put my needle down in the fully down position. I'm going to raise my presser foot and I'm going to close the zipper. This can be a little tricky because you have to like kind of work around the needle, but you should be able to close it. There we go. You just kind of have to finagle it a little bit. All right, so now you kind of have to eyeball this because we don't have the seam allowance line over there. So what you're going to do is you're going to sew in a very straight line, as straight as possible, until you get to the base of the zipper, and that's where that seam opens up right here. I'll put a pin right there so you can see it. When I get down there, I'm going to pivot, okay? And we'll talk about that when I get there. But for now, I'm just sewing in a nice straight line, and I'm going to stop with my needle down. It's already down, so I don't need to do the hand wheel. Pivoting means raising your presser foot with the needle all the way down in the fabric and pivoting the fabric so you form a 90-degree angle with your stitching. And now I'm just going to stitch across the base of the zipper to secure it across the bottom. And because I'm stitching in a really small area here, I'm just going to stitch by hand. A lot of people don't realize that they can actually just make the machine go by hand. And then you get a lot more control that way when you're just trying to do a couple stitches. And now I'm going to backstitch to finish off. All right, so raise your needle all the way. Very important anytime you're sewing, you want to make sure that your needle is fully raised before you take the work out. Otherwise, it's going to lead to all sorts of threading problems. If you have something, a lot of people say, my machine keeps coming unthreaded when I start a seam. You want to make sure when you end a seam that you see the take-up lever at the top of your machine like this. Okay, so now your zipper is completely in. So if you close it like that, you can see the top stitching, and that is your beautiful lap zipper. So the next thing we're going to do is the gathering along the waistline. So now that we've put in the zipper, we can move on to gathering the waistline of the skirt. The usual method for doing gathering is to do 2 lines of long stitches, so long by 4 or 5 millimeter stitches. They can also be called basting stitches, doing those by machine right on top of each other all the way around the area you want to gather, and then pulling up the bobbin threads. That can be a little frustrating because as you're trying to pull the bobbin threads, sometimes they break, and especially if you're gathering a large area in a fabric like taffeta, it can be very frustrating to do it with the bobbin threads. So I'm going to show you a really awesome, cool method using dental floss. I love this. What we're going to do is zigzag over the dental floss and then just pull the dental floss up. So let me show you what I mean. It makes the whole thing so much simpler. So you're going to start, you can leave your zipper open. We are going to start by changing our presser foot, where I have the zipper foot on here now, so I just want to switch back to my regular presser foot. And we're going to use a zigzag stitch. So you want to change your machine setting to zigzag. For me, that would be changing it to 2 on my machine here. And you want this to be the widest zigzag possible, okay? So you're going to set it on 5 on my machine. I'm already there. And then you also want it to be a longer stitch. So I'm going to move my stitch length from 2.5 to 4, okay? So what I've got is a wide, long zigzag. All right, so place your fabric underneath the presser foot, and we're going to be working in the seam allowance here. So I would recommend aligning the raw edge of your fabric with the 3/8 of an inch mark. And then you're going to take your dental floss and pull out a really long bit here. So I'm going to just lay my dental floss underneath the center of the presser foot, like that. Lower the presser foot so it holds it in place, and I left myself a long tail of dental floss behind there. Now I'm going to start stitching, and what you want to see is the zigzag going to either side of the dental floss, like that, okay? So I'm going to hold the dental floss in front, and I'm zigzagging so that my needle goes to either side of the dental floss. And the other thing I like about this is that it makes your project nice and minty fresh. It really gives it a nice scent. And the thing that's so great about dental floss for this is that dental flosses are treated with something that helps them glide easily. So it glides nice and smoothly against your fabric rather than having to tug those annoying bobbin threads up. So it's really nice. I like this method a lot. So what you're looking for as you're stitching this is you want to make sure that you don't actually stitch the dental floss down. You want to be stitching to either side of it so that you're going to be able to move it freely after we sew the whole thing. You might need to go kind of slow just to make sure that you align everything well. They do sell specialty presser feet, not for dental floss specifically, that would be weird, but for cording, where it's a presser foot that holds the cord down the center of the foot and helps it not move. And I have used that with dental floss before, and it was amazing. So I keep meaning to get one for my machine, but I haven't yet. But I would recommend that if you're shopping for new presser feet, you might want to look for a cording foot if this is something you think you're going to be doing a lot of. And this is a long stretch we have to do here, because this is 3 times your waist measurement. Oh, we're almost at the side seam, so we're almost halfway done. If you accidentally stitch the dental floss, it's not really the end of the world if you just do it in one place, because you can still pull the dental floss from either end. But if you do it in several places, you're probably going to have to go back and start over and take those stitches out. You can at least take it out just in the area where you stitched over it and re-zigzag there. You could just do that area and not have to do the whole thing. But this is kind of a good exercise if you're a beginner in just like learning how to handle your machine and kind of being aware of not stitching over something. So you're really gaining a lot of control. So you're going to pull out more dental floss. You need a lot. Hopefully you're stocked up. I never keep it in my sewing room, so I always have to go to the bathroom and get it. And then I wonder why I'm out of dental floss so often. So you might want to buy in bulk if you're going to do a lot of gathered skirts. Okay, we're almost there. And then we get to see the kind of magical part, which is pulling up the dental floss to create the gathers. Right now it still looks flat, but this next part is really going to transform the skirt into the gathered skirt. Okay, there we are. So now that you're at the end, you are going to cut your threads and then also cut your dental floss, but leave yourself several inches at the end there. All right, so I'm zigzagged all the way around on top of my dental floss. And what I'm going to do now is pull the dental floss ends to create those gathers. So you can see how it starts to gather up like this. And you want to distribute the gathers so that they're even. So, it'll become more clear how much you need to gather once we put the waistband on. That will be kind of the guide for how many gathers you need to make, how tight the gathers need to be. So for now, just gather them so they look kind of like your waist size, or close to it, and that they're fairly evenly distributed. And there we go. There's one side gathered. And this dental floss technique really makes it so easy to just pull it along there like that. And if we had done the other technique, especially if you're using a tightly woven fabric like taffeta, you would probably really be struggling with pulling that. But here, it's just super simple. And like I said, the dental floss has that finish on it that makes it nice and smooth. So I gathered one side of the skirt. I gathered the back of the skirt, and now I'm doing the other side. You don't want to pull all from one end so that you have one really long end of dental floss hanging on one side and then not the other. Okay, so keep gathering until it kind of looks close to your waist size. We can kind of leave it there for now. And then just distribute the gathers so that the most challenging thing about gathers is that if you don't distribute them evenly, you can end up with like a clump of gathers in one place and then no gathers in another place. So we're going to work more on this on the next step, but it's really important to evenly distribute those gathers around the waistline so that they don't look uneven. Okay, so there we have our gathering done, and the next thing we're going to do is sew the waistband on. Okay, we just finished gathering the waistline of the skirt, and now we're going to move on to sewing the waistband. So grab your waistband piece with the interfacing on it and go over to your iron, and what you're going to do is fold it in half lengthwise with the wrong sides on the inside. So the interfacing should be on the inside like this. And you're just going to fold it in half and press a crease in the top of the waistband like this, so that when we sew it, we know exactly where the top of the waistband is supposed to fall. And that will give us a nice built-in crease there as we go along. And now you can kind of see how the waistband is coming together and why we made the pattern this way with it double the width that we wanted, because now we're going to be folding it down in half. So its finished width will be 1.5 inches. But just press in your crease like this. There we go. Okay, and the next thing you're going to do is just open that out a bit, and you're going to turn in one seam allowance. And this is going to help us later when we get to actually sewing the waistband on. This is just a little shortcut that will help us when we get to the next few steps. So along one end, it actually doesn't matter which long edge you do, as long as you do one of them, you're going to fold in 5/8 of an inch. So your entire seam allowance is going to be folded in like this. And you can use that trick we talked about earlier of kind of finger pressing it first to kind of get it to stay like that. Sometimes I'll even use like the edge of my thumbnail like that to kind of build in a crease, because it is kind of a pain going back and forth between the iron like this, picking up the iron, then picking up the ruler. So I just try to do as much as I can in one little go. Okay, and you might have seen a little seam gauge tool that you could use for this. It's just kind of like a short little metal ruler with a little gauge on it, a little tab that you can move back and forth, which can be helpful. But I just keep a ton of these clear rulers around. I just find them helpful for everything, so I tend to use them all the time, no matter what. And I find them fine for this purpose. Okay, this is kind of a long stretch. right, so all the way to the end, 5/8 of an inch is pressed in. Okay, and this is going to seem a little weird, but trust me. What we're going to do now is trim down this seam allowance a little bit so it's all ready to go once we are sewing the waistband and kind of finishing it. We don't want it to be the full seam allowance once we're finished. So go ahead and trim this seam allowance down, the one that you just pressed in. Trim it about 1/4 inch, not a whole lot, just a little bit. About 1/4 inch like that. And this way you don't have to trim this after you sew on the waistband. It's a lot easier to handle like this when it's not attached to the skirt. So that's why I do it now. And you can kind of eyeball this amount. You don't have to be real persnickety about it. But just as long as it looks like a good 1/4 inch there, or even a little less is fine. Don't trim too much, that's the important thing. You don't want it to be too short, because then it gets difficult to turn in when we get to the next steps. Okay. All right, waistband is pressed in half. It is turned in on the seam allowance and now trimmed. So now we're ready to sew it to the skirt. So let's go back over here to our skirt. I'm going to scoot on over. And we're going to start by pinning it to the zipper opening. So you can have your zipper opened here. I'm starting by pinning on the overlap side of the lap zipper. Now remember, this is where we have that extension for the hook and eye. So the waistband is going to extend 1 1/4 inches past the zipper opening here. So take your ruler and measure this because it needs to be precise. Let's see how close I got. Oh, I'm 1/8 of an inch off. So I want to get it so it's 1 5/8 inches. Exactly, that extends beyond the zipper opening. Come back. There we go. All right, so that needs to extend that full 1.5 inches there. All right, so zipper opening here, 1 5/8 inches here. On the other side, now the waistband's going to wrap all the way around. It's going to finish over here on this opening. And notice that I'm pinning the side that I didn't turn in and press here. This is the raw edge that's unpressed. Okay, now this side is only going to extend 5/8 of an inch past the zipper opening because it doesn't have the overlap. It just has the seam allowance. So pin it there like so. And I didn't say this, but hopefully you've gathered it. I'm putting the right sides of the fabric together, okay, here. So right side of the waistband to the right side of the skirt. All right, so now that I have those seam allowances and extensions and all that dealt with, what I want you to do is put the zipper pieces together like this so that the zipper tape matches on either side. Then pull out your waistband so that it forms a ring like this. And then I want you to put a little pin, divide it in half perfectly like that, and that will find where your side seam is supposed to be, because it should be halfway. Remember, the front and the back are the same pattern piece, so they should be distributed perfectly evenly between front and the back after we did those extensions and the seam allowance there. So that pin I just put there, I'm going to match up to the side seam of the skirt. So you're going to have to kind of dig around in your gathers there. I found my side seam, and I'm going to match that up and pin them together. And now I can just concentrate on the front and the back separately. And what you need to do is lay them together like this and then pull up the gathers, so pull up the dental floss so that it matches, so that the length of the skirt is the same length as the waistband, okay? So they need to match now. So that skirt was really long and big, and now we're gathering it down so it's the same size as the waistband. The other thing that we're looking for is we want the gathers to be evenly distributed. See how I have kind of like a clump of gathers over here, but it's not so gathered on this side? You want to pull the gathers along the dental floss so that we have more gathers where we want them and less where we don't. So in pattern instructions, you'll often see things like that, like evenly distribute the gathers across the sleeve or the waistline or whatever it is. And that's what they mean. They want the gathers to look even across the entire piece that you're gathering. And it's honestly like so frustrating. And you can sit here for hours and work on this and try to get them perfectly even. But don't make yourself crazy. Remember that gathers aren't supposed to look totally perfect. They kind of have like a free and easy look to them. So once you're happy with the amount that they're distributed, then you're going to start to pin. And kind of like we did earlier with pinning on the side seams, I like to pin at either end and then kind of divide the distance that I'm pinning and pin that in the center so that I'm evenly distributing my pins over the entire piece. Okay, so I'm going to put a, you want to use more pins rather than less when you're pinning gathers to something, because you spent a lot of time doing the distribution of the gathers, and now you want to make sure that they stay where you put them. So even, every ½ inch you could do with the pins. Don't hold back on the pinning. Okay. All right, so once you're happy with your amount of pins and the distribution of your gathers, we need to go and do the other side of the skirt. Same exact thing. So on this side, let's put this down like that. You're going to pull up the dental floss so that the length of the pieces match. Like so. And then you're going to distribute your gathers. It's worth noting that different fabrics gather really differently. The red sample skirt, which I made in taffeta, it took me a while to gather that waistband, just because the waistline of the skirt, just because taffeta is has a little bit more of a mind of its own. It's not quite so free and easy as this rayon challis. So I was kind of futzing with that for a while, and finally got it where I wanted it. But these gathers are going to just be a lot more pliable than something like taffeta would be, just because this fabric is so flowy. So I'm actually finding this a lot easier to gather than I did with the taffeta. It just shows you how different fabrics behave so differently. Okay. So once you're happy with your pinning and the way your gathers look, we are ready to actually sew this waistband on. So you're going to start on one end like this. Some people will tell you to sew with your gathers on the bottom so that they're against the feed dogs, which pull them through the fabric. Those feed dogs are those little jagged pieces that pull the fabric through. I am not one of those people. I kind of recommend that you keep the gathers on top so you can keep an eye on them and they're not turning into little pleats as you sew. But you might want to try both ways and see how it goes. All right, you got to be very careful not to sew over the zipper pull, or the zipper stop, excuse me, because that's metal and again, your zipper will break. Okay, machine settings. The last thing we were doing was sewing a zigzag, remember, because we were zigzagging our dental floss on. But now we need to go back to our regular machine settings. So our stitch length, we're going to do a straight stitch. So I'm going to go back to 1 on my machine. And then this is just a regular seam, so I'm going to be at 2.5 for my stitch length. And we're good to go. All right, so start stitching, back stitch, watch your zipper stop, and you're going to stitch, pulling out your pins and kind of holding your gathers flat as you go. Yeah, all right. So the thing about gathers when you're sewing them is they can kind of try to form these weird folds and get under the presser foot in ways that are annoying. So you kind of have to keep everything flat and kind of try to press everything flat as you stitch. And if it starts getting too like pushed under the presser foot, you might have to stop. And remember, you always want to stop with your needle down if you need to raise the presser foot. So just for instance, I could stop with my needle down like this, lift the presser foot, and kind of rearrange my gathers underneath the presser foot so that they don't look quite so smushed flat. Don't forget to take your pins out. You know, taking your pins out is one of those rules. There are some rules that I'll kind of break and bend, but that's the one I'm really, really careful about. Only because I've never seen someone actually lose an eye, which is what people tell you can happen. Never actually seen that happen. But I did see someone who was sewing over his pins, and his pin got bent and then sucked down into the needle hole of the machine, and completely broke his machine, like had to have major repairs on it. So even if you're not worried about your eyesight, just think about your sewing machine. All right. And it's kind of annoying to keep breaking needles too. And remember that you do want to replace your needles pretty often. Like every couple project, you want to replace your machine needle. It's really important. A lot of people, I know a lot of people who are still using the machine that came, still using the needle that came on the machine and have never changed it. And then when it breaks, they have no idea what to do. You should really be changing that needle like every few projects. And you also want to make sure that you're using the right size needle for your machine. I'm sorry, not for your machine, but for the fabric you're working on. So for thinner fabrics, you use a smaller needle. And for thicker fabrics, you use a larger needle. It's pretty simple. But there are a lot of different kind of needles out there, like top stitching needles and denim needles and all that. But for this kind of sewing, you can just use a regular microtex needle or a universal needle is what you're going to be looking for. Yeah, and a good example of using needle size, the correct needle size, is actually when I was working on that red taffeta skirt. I just started by using the needle that was in the machine, which is a really common thing to do and what I tell people not to do. But I did it, and my needle kept getting stuck in the fabric. Like it would actually get stuck down in the fabric and not come out, and it would kind of make these weird puckery noises. And I finally realized I was using a needle that was way too big for that taffeta. And because taffeta is so fine and tightly woven, the needle was going in and actually just sticking in there. So what I needed was a microtex needle, which is the sharpest kind of needle you can get that would really puncture the fabric. And I also needed a smaller needle, so I used a size 10, which is on the smaller side. And then as you go up in number, the needles get bigger. Okay, I'm almost to my end here. I'm going to back stitch in a minute after I get to the end. I'm just being mindful of not sewing over that zipper stop. All right, now I can pull it out. I'm going to cut my threads, and I'm just going to check that, oh, I missed a pin, just like I was saying not to. So I'm going to just check that everything looks good from the outside, and I'm happy with how my gathers look. And I am. So I am going to go ahead and cut my dental floss off now because it's actually getting to a point where it's really annoying to have it streaming off like this. So, and actually what you can do is pull the whole thing out because we don't need it anymore. So, and that's another nice thing about this dental floss is it comes out really easily. And now we can just get rid of it. I've actually had the thought as I was doing it, I was like, that's a lot of dental floss to waste, and kind of thought about using it, like kind of coiling it back up and putting it in the bathroom, but I kind of think probably getting rid of it is the thing to do at this point. All right, so now my skirt is all gathered and sewn into my waistband. The next thing we're gonna do is trim down these seam allowances on the inside. So fold that waistband back out. And you're going to trim them separately. We have the seam allowance that's all gathered, right? That one I want you to trim pretty short, like down to an 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, pretty short, to get rid of that bulk. Because as you can see, a gathered seam allowance, it gets pretty bulky and it takes up a lot of space in there, and it would kind of form a ridge on the inside of your waistband. You don't want that. So get rid of as much of this as you can, but be very careful not to actually cut into your skirt or into your waistband, for that matter. And if you can, hold your scissors at a little bit of an angle so that they're tilted towards you, and that helps bevel the edge a little bit so it's not quite so blunt when you cut. All right, so all the way across. All right, trim that whole thing away. All right, now you're gonna have all these curly bits that you can kind of put to the side, throw away. And the next thing we're gonna do is trim the other seam allowance down. But you don't have to trim it quite as short. You can trim it to about an 1/8 of an inch higher than the last one you did. And trimming 2 seam allowances to different lengths like this is called grading the seam allowance. And it's used quite often on like a waistband, anywhere that 2 seam allowances are going to be living pressed next to each other rather than like the skirt side seams, which we pressed open. Here we have to worry about there being a certain amount of bulk inside the waistband once you get all these seam allowances on top of each other. So by cutting them to different lengths, we don't have to worry about there being like a little ridge or blunt end that forms inside there that could show on the outside of the waistband. Okay, so now we've trimmed those down. I want to press up this seam allowance towards the waistband. So I'm going to grab my sleeve board here, just have a little raised surface to do this on. And I'm going to press that seam allowance up towards the waistband. They're both getting pressed together. So not like the side seams where we press the seam allowances open. Here we're pressing them both in one direction together. Okay, so we have that all nice and pressed, and now it's going to look nice and flat from the outside. The next thing we're going to do is sew the short ends of the waistband, okay? So these raw edges here. These need to get folded right sides together along the fold that you made lengthwise on the waistband. And you can fold them with the seam allowances turned up the way they already are. And we're going to pin them together like this. And make sure that the edges of those seam allowances match here. That's very important. So you're pinning like so, and now we're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch here. So I'm going to start a little bit in and then back stitch. And now go forward to the end. And back stitch again. All right. Don't forget to trim your threads. All right, now I've got a little bit of excess on the end here that I can trim off. Now, what you want to do on these corners here is kind of trim at an angle, which reduces bulk on the inside. So where you have anytime you have a corner that's sewn, you want to cut into it diagonally like that, and then you can trim down your seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch, like so. And what's going to happen next is that's going to get turned right side out. But before we do that, we need to do the other short end of the waistband. Okay, so here we go again. Right sides together. You need those bottom folds matching. And I'm going to pin. I think I'm going to sew it from this way like I did the other. That way I can see that metal zipper stop. And again, I'm going to sew it 5/8 of an inch. Don't forget to backstitch. My zipper tape's getting a little in the way, so I'm just going to pull it out there. Here we go. And don't forget to backstitch again. And here we're just going to trim our threads and then trim the corners diagonally, just like we did on the other one. So trim diagonally there, trim diagonally that way, and then trim your seam allowance. Okay, so now our waistband can be turned right side out. It's going to really start looking like a waistband now. You can kind of poke those corners out with your finger. If they're not quite sharp enough, what I would do is take a little pin. So you're just going to pull out the point with a pin. Just kind of dig in there and pull it out. Like so. And we're going to turn the other short end out as well. And again, you can pull out the point. Don't go too crazy digging in there, because then you can kind of get loose threads that come out and stuff. But that's your basic idea. So now you've got the waistband turned to the inside, but now we need to secure it on the inside of the skirt. There are different ways that you can do that, and the way I'm going to show you today is by top stitching all around the waistband. And the best way to do this is to fold the waistband down like this so that it covers the seam line that you sewed. And then we're going to pin it, but you need to pin it from the outside of the skirt. So fold here like this, and then turn it over and pin from the right side so that you're pinning through all the layers. And the reason you want the pins on the right side is because top stitching always happens from the right side of the garment. Well, it would be nice if I could just stitch it from the inside like that. It's not quite as effective because I want to make sure that I'm really aligning everything so that the top stitching is right next to those seam lines, is really nice and even. And the best way to do that is from the right side of the skirt. So that's why we're doing it this way. If you don't feel like pinning is secure enough, the other thing you can do is fold this down and then stitch it in place by hand, using a hand needle and a nice long stitch, and just kind of hold it in place temporarily. That's called basting, just using a long temporary hand stitch to hold it in place, and then you can sew it and remove the basting after you're done with the machine stitching. But for our purposes today, I think this pinning is going to be plenty. And this step is pretty exciting because after you're done top stitching, it's going to really look beautiful and professional. Okay, so when you're turning this down, just make sure that you're covering all the seams on the inside. And you can even see now how this is going to have a nice clean finish on the inside of the skirt, covering up all those seam allowances and everything. Okay, so I've pinned all around the outside of the skirt. What I'm going to do now is top stitch. That means sewing from the right side. And I'm going to sew around all four corners of the waistband, okay? So I'm going to put it under the machine, and I'm going to start in one corner. And what you want to do here is you want to be sewing close to the edge of the fabric, about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. So what you need to do is find a spot on the presser foot where you can sort of train your eye so that you get this line of stitching nice and even. Okay, so we're going to keep sewing along this top edge here. And remember, your goal here is accuracy. So really looking for, like a ballerina, you know, when you find that spot on the wall when you're doing your pirouettes, which I was never very good at. But this is kind of the same thing. You find your spot on the presser foot and you keep looking at it. And you guide your fabric into that spot. A lot of people make the mistake of, when they first start sewing, is what they do is they watch the needle go up and down, which is actually kind of like dizzying the more you look at it. So don't look at the needle. Look at your spot on the presser foot or on the throat plate, which is that metal piece with all the markings on it. That's where you want to be looking. Okay, when you get to the end here, go forward with your hand wheel until you get to the exact spot where you want to turn your corner. And here, you're going to stop with the needle down. Remember, anytime you lift the presser foot, as you're sewing, you want to make sure that that needle is down so that the fabric doesn't come out of the machine. Now, you're going to turn your corner and start stitching along this short end. And again, I'm going to pivot at the bottom here. I'm going to go one more stitch, stop with the needle down, and then turn the fabric again. Kind of like stuck on something here. Just gonna jump this forward a little bit. Okay, there we go. I think my zipper stop is underneath there, so I just got a little stuck. I had to scoot forward a little bit. Okay, now this side is gonna look a little different because now we're sewing next to the seam line rather than to the fold of the waistband, the upper edge. But it's the same idea. You are still top stitching and you're still finding that spot on your presser foot, but instead of matching up the edge of the fabric with it, you're matching up the edge of the waistband, the bottom edge, so the seam line that you sewed, with the spot on your presser foot. And now you can kind of see why we put the pins on this side, because it would be impossible to take them out as we sewed if we put them on the underside. All right, so keep sewing. We're almost there. And after this step, all we have left to do is put the hook and eye on the waistband and then sew the hem, and then the skirt is done. So we're very close. And this is kind of tricky, sewing this part, because usually when you're sewing, 99% of the time, you have your fabric to the left of the needle. It's hard to sew with all this fabric on the inside of the machine. So just go slow and you gotta kind of like bunch the fabric through this little window here on the machine. And you can kind of rearrange your fabric as you go, making sure you don't have any extra folds underneath there. That can happen when you're sewing a round thing like we are right now. And what this top stitching is going to do, besides holding the waistband in place on the inside, is it's also going to keep the waistband laying nice and flat. So it's going to feel really nice and smooth and bulk-free, which, is not necessarily what you would feel if you didn't top stitch. You would be able to feel like the folds of the fabric and the layers of the fabric. This is going to make it feel like a nice single layer of fabric that's going to lay nice and smooth against the body. And And you can, because I'm using this contrasting thread, you can kind of get a sense of how top stitching can be used as a design feature too. It's not just a technical construction thing. Top stitching is very often done in a contrasting thread color, and actually also often done in a thicker thread called top stitching or heavy duty thread, so that it really stands out on the garment, because it's often, like I said, often used as a design feature, not just something that's a construction feature. All right, so I have my last pivot right here. And now that I'm getting to this last corner, what I'm going to do is I think what I'm going to do, what I just decided to do, is I want to pivot one more time and overlap my stitching from the beginning a little bit, just so it's extra secure here. And then back stitch. And there we go. Voila, that is our waistband. So as I cut my threads, I just want to show you, like, it looks really nice with the contrast stitching. It really adds something nice there. So you might want to do a little contrast stitching on yours too. All right, now that the waistband is on, the next thing we'll want to do is sew a hook and eye closure on the overlap. So if you close your zipper, you'll see how you have this little extra overlap, and remember that's the extra inch that we added on the pattern, so that we can close it like this and the hook and eye will go beneath it. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab your package of hooks and eyes, I guess is the way to say that. Open it up. All right, so the bigger side, kind of like the rounded curve here, this is the hook. And this hook goes right on the edge of the overlap on the inside, and then it's going to get sewn like this. This has to be sewn by hand, so grab your hand sewing needle and a little bit of thread. So I would recommend just using a single length of thread for this. I know a lot of people hand stitch with a double length of thread, but it tends to get knotted a little more easily, especially when you're doing small jobs like this. All right, so thread your needle and then knot the end. Okay, and trim off any excess after the knot there. And all you really need to do to sew on a hook, and also the eye part of this, is to do tiny little stitches, basically like little whip stitches, that go through the holes in the hook. So see, on 3 sides of the hook there are little holes built in. You just take little stitches right on top of each other through the skirt, but don't go to the outside of the skirt, okay? I'm just going through one layer of the waistband, the inside layer. Okay, now that I've done one hole, I'm moving on to the next. So, you know, I did 3-4 stitches in that hole maybe. I have to say, I always hate this part. This is like the part of sewing I dread for some reason. When I get to the hook and eye, I just feel like, oh my God, I did all of that sewing, now I have to do this too. But it really is like the tiniest little job. I just have some sort of block against it. Okay, now you're gonna go to the next hole on the side. And you may see in some books and sewing articles and stuff like that, they will recommend sewing this on with a special stitch called a buttonhole stitch or a blanket stitch, which is extra secure. But I've always found just the regular, this is a whip stitch, what we're doing right now. It's just simple in and out, and then you pull it. I've always found this to be perfectly secure. And sometimes I think the simplest solution is the best. So I just do mine this way. But you may see that and want to try it at some point. Okay, now when I go from one hole to the other, I kind of try to hide my thread between the layers so that I don't have these long thread skips. So just go in and out the thread between the layers. Now I'm on the last side. It really is pretty quick to do this, but sometimes it just feels like an extra chore at the end of a fun project. All right, and then our final hole on this, and then we'll do the eye side. Now this type of hook and eye is made specifically for overlapping waistbands, okay? There are other kinds of hooks and eyes out there. You've probably seen them that are much smaller. Those are generally for things that meet together, like butt up against each other, like the back neckline of a dress or something on top of a zipper. They are not made for lapped waistbands like this one. So that's why we're using this particular kind. Okay, now that I got to the last hole, I'm just going to take a couple stitches, pull my thread through the loop to form a knot. And I'll do that a couple times. There we go. And now I can cut my thread close. All right, that is the hook side. Now we obviously need to sew the eye side as well. You got to figure out the placement for the eye. And what you want to do is overlap the waistband like this, like it's going to be worn. And put the eye into the hook. So close it in there like that. So it kind of clicks in and stays in there. So once you do that, now you're going to overlap the waistband just the way it's going to be worn. Okay? And then that's going to help you figure out where the hook should be. So sometimes what I'll do is actually make like a pin mark or a chalk mark so that I know where I want to place that eye so that it's correctly even with the hook. All right, so now that I've pin marked it, I can pull that apart, take the eye out of the hook, and that's where I'm going to place it, right where I pin marked it. Whoops, now I need to knot my thread again. Okay. So last little hand sewing chore. We're going to sew this eye on. So I'm going to place it right where I put those pins. And I can hold it in place with my thumb to secure it. And now just the exact same thing, just whip stitch through those little holes. Do several stitches on either side. And then through the other side. I actually really like hand sewing, but sometimes when you're doing a project like this where it's mostly machine sewing, it feels like you really have to slow down to do this. And that's nice, you know, it's a relaxed, hand sewing is kind of a nice relaxing thing if you kind of slow down and let yourself relax into it. It's something you can do while you watch TV or something like that. All right, so I'm going to knot this side off like that. And I'm just going to start a new knot, a new length of thread for the other side, just because they're so far apart. Okay. So there, now that I've placed that, I can just start whip stitching through here. Whoops, I lost my thread, hold on. You should never hold needles in your mouth like I just did. I actually know someone who laughed while she was holding a needle in her mouth, and she sucked the needle in and like had to have it removed. So there's a cautionary tale for you. I still kind of do it, but you're really not supposed to. Pins, needles, anything like that. It's very tempting, though. Okay. All right. So once you do those last little stitches, do a final knot off, like that. There we go, and now you can trim your thread close. And now there we have it. All right, there's your hook and eye, and that's how it looks closed. All right, so now that we've sewn the waistband and put on the hook and eye, we can move on to the final step, which is sewing the hem. Okay, we just finished putting on their waistband and the hook and eye, so the final thing to do is to hem the skirt. And I'm going to show you a method of hemming that is super easy, and it doesn't involve turning up the hem and ironing it and measuring it and all that stuff. So what we're going to do is use a method that involves something that I call guide stitching. I think other people call it that too. I don't think it's just me. But what you do is you run a line of stitching around the bottom of the skirt, which is going to serve as a guide for your pressing later. What can be frustrating about narrow hems is that you have to turn up a really narrow portion of fabric and press it, and you're working in a really close place with the iron. It often results in steam burns and all sorts of fun things like that. This method makes it a lot easier and a lot less dangerous. So what we're going to do is do a line of guide stitching at 1/4 inch. And 1/4 inch is also the edge of your presser foot, a standard presser foot. So you can just line up the edge of your fabric with the edge of the presser foot to make it super simple. And you're just stitching all the way around the bottom of the skirt. So this is just a long stretch of easy stitching through one layer. I don't have it folded up or anything yet. It will be eventually, obviously, because hems often, well, they're always folded up. Sometimes they're double folded, sometimes just single folded. So stitch all the way around. And this line of guide stitching is going to be super helpful. I love this technique because it's letting something that's super simple on your machine, you're letting it work for you rather than doing something that's super complicated and results in frustration. So anytime you have to turn up a fabric a certain amount, you can always do a line of guide stitching around your hem allowance. Now when you're stitching over the seam allowances, make sure that you keep them open. So you want to make sure that your seam allowances stay open when you stitch them so that they don't get folded on top of one another. Okay. We're almost there. All right. So you just want to sew, and again, make sure those seam allowances stay open. Sew until your lines of stitching meet. You don't need to backstitch for this. It's more of a utility stitch, meaning that it's a temporary stitch that serves a purpose, but it's not like integral to the construction. Okay, so now that I have my line of guide stitching there, I'm going to go over to my ironing station. Ooh, there we go. And I'm going to turn up the hem along the guide stitching. So the way you want to think of this is that you're using the guide stitching as a tool to help you turn the fabric. So you want your line of guide stitching to be just inside the skirt. You don't want to see it on the edge of the skirt. You really don't want to see it on the outside of the skirt. You want it to be on the inside of the skirt. Okay, so we're going to go all the way around doing this pressing. And it's much, much easier. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to me how it works, because what this line of guide stitching does is it creates this kind of like hard edge on the fabric that lets you turn up and manipulate the fabric. Because the standard way of doing this is to use a small ruler and turn it up and measure as you go. Which is just really kind of frustrating because you have to keep stop. You know, we've done it on a couple sections here that we couldn't use guide stitching on. You have to, measure, stop, pick up the iron, put the ruler down, then reverse it all until you've gone all the way around. So this I just love this guide stitching technique because it eliminates all of that fuss. Okay, so we're going to go all the way around. Until you get back to the beginning. Okay, we're almost back to the beginning now. And when we get there, we're going to turn up the entire thing again, so it'll be a double folded hem. So it will hide this raw edge that you see now, and it will also hide the guide stitching. So we're not going to see that on the finished skirt. Okay, I'm back to where I started pressing with the guide stitching. And now what I'm going to do is just double that fold up. Okay, so turn it like this so that the entire hem is doubled. So now we have that little double narrow hem there. And you can pin this in place if you like as you go. It's totally up to you. It will have the creases pressed in there, so even if it comes undone as you iron, you'll be able to refold it as you stitch, which is the next step. What I usually end up doing is just pinning it in a few places so it doesn't come completely undone, but not really going crazy with the pins here. Whoops, I lost a pin. Okay. So you can kind of see how people always say, you know, when you're sewing, you should be spending as much time at the ironing board as you do at your machine, and it's kind of true. Though you also spend a lot of time at the cutting table, especially when you start making your own patterns. You're going to be spending a lot of time you know, drawing and cutting your own patterns, cutting out your fabric. And people think of sewing as being, you know, really sitting and working at the machine, but there are lots of other components to it to get a really nice finished product. And pressing is a huge part of it. Okay, one more side. So I'm just going to finish this up. So now I've double folded hem all the way around. Few pins, just to kind of hold it in place there. And now the last thing we have to do is stitch it down. So let's scoot back to the machine. And we're going to start stitching the hem. When I do a hem or something like this, I always like to start stitching at a seam line, so at a side seam. Kind of helps disguise it because there's a little more going on there rather than if you did it like just in the middle of the piece. So what you're going to do is you're going to stitch along the edge, and this is exactly what we did on the waistband fold. You found a spot on your presser foot to help you stitch as close as possible to the folded edge. Don't forget to backstitch. The difference here is that I am stitching on the inside. This would technically be called edge stitching rather than top stitching because we're not doing it from the top of the fabric. I like to have my stitching right on the edge of a hem, so I typically do it from the inside. So yeah, this would be called edge stitching. And it's very closely related to top stitching. It's visible stitching that you see. It can be contrast or not. And it's usually utilitarian in some way. It's holding layers together, like a hem or a waistband, the edges of a collar, whatever it is. Now the way you hold your fabric is pretty important here. You want to kind of hold it out with your right hand and keep it nice and taut so that the hem doesn't ripple as you sew. Don't forget to take out your pins. Okay, we're almost at our side seam here. I'm just gonna rearrange my fabric underneath there. Sometimes the fabric can kind of creep up between the toes of the presser foot, so I was just rearranging. I'm gonna pull that pin out. And with this kind of stitching, you can kind of see what I'm doing is holding the fabric taut from the front of the needle, from the front of the presser foot, and behind it. So instead of really guiding the fabric like you usually do, I'm really holding it taut. And that is going to help me avoid getting any ripples in the hem. Okay, almost there. Now you're going to want your 2 lines of stitching on the hem to meet up. So just right on top of each other, they should just overlap slightly, and then backstitch. Okay. There we have it. That is our stitched hem. I'm going to cut my threads close here. All right, so you've made a skirt. So what I would recommend doing, what I always recommend doing, is just doing a final press of your entire skirt. Just go over the entire thing with the iron, the hem, the waistband, all of that, just so you feel like your finished project is totally pristine and ready to wear. And then there we have it. This is our finished skirt. It looks so beautiful. So now that you've made this skirt, what you'll want to do is go ahead and make it in a bunch of different fabrics. And you can try doing it in the taffeta, something that's really full and has more of a party wear kind of effect. Try do it in something a little drapier. I always recommend for beginners that if you find a pattern you really like, make it a few times, do it in different fabrics, try different things, especially because the more you sew a single project, you'll find that it gets easier and easier each time. You feel more confident, and confidence is so important when it comes to sewing. So I hope you enjoyed the class. Thank you so much for watching.